She spent 7 years hiding inside, a crawl space above her grandmother's house. 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, 3 feet tall at the highest point. She could not stand. She could not walk. She could barely breathe. And still, it was the freest she had ever been. Her name was Harriet Ann Jacobs. She was born in 1813 in Edenton, North Carolina, a small port town sitting at the edge of the Albemarle Sound, where the water was wide and brown and the smell of salt never quite left the air. Edenton was not unusual. It was every town. It was the ordinary machinery of American life in the antebellum South. There were churches here. There were tea parties. There were lawyers and merchants and women who wore white gloves to Sunday service. And there were human beings who were property. Harriet's mother was Delilah. Her father was Daniel Jacobs, a skilled carpenter, a man of considerable talent. Both were enslaved. Harriet would later write, in her own hand, in the book that would shake a nation, that she did not fully understand what she was until she was 6 years old. Until she was 6, she had simply been a child. She had been loved. She had been safe. Her mother's enslaver was Margaret Horniblow, a woman described in period accounts as kind, by the standards of her class and her era, by which we mean she treated the people she owned as human beings when it suited her. When Harriet was 6, her mother died. Delilah's death did not free Harriet. It could not. Harriet was property, and property did not grieve. Property was transferred. Margaret Horniblow, to her credit, by the calculations of that world, chose to keep Harriet. She taught her to read. She taught her to sew. She called her, by some accounts, almost a favorite. This was the cruelty of it. Not the lash, not the chain, but the word almost. Almost safe, almost free, almost human, in the eyes of a law that saw only livestock. In 1825, when Harriet was approximately 12 years old, Margaret Horniblow died, and Harriet Jacobs, literate, beloved, 12 years old, waited to hear what would happen to her. Margaret's will had promised her freedom. The will gave her instead to Margaret's 5-year-old niece, a child named Mary Matilda Norcom, which meant that Harriet now belonged, legally, completely, without appeal, to a 5-year-old girl, and to that girl's father. His name was Dr. James Norcom, and the story of the next decade of Harriet Jacobs' life is, in many ways, the story of one woman's war against one man. A war she had not chosen, a war she had not started, a war she would not lose. James Norcom was, by every external measure, a respectable man. He was a physician. He was a community leader. He was a husband and a father of 11 children. He was also, by documented testimony, across multiple court records and Harriet's own detailed account, a predator who began sexually harassing her when she was approximately 13 years old. Let that number sit. 13. Norcom was 52. He did not touch her first. He whispered. Harriet wrote later that he began with words, low, insistent, inescapable, murmured when no one else could hear. In corridors, at doorways, in the kitchen where she worked, he told her she was beautiful. He told her she belonged to him. He told her that what he wanted was inevitable. She was 13 years old, and she had no legal recourse. She had no voice in any court. She had no body that the law recognized as her own. What Harriet had was her mind, and she used it, she told her grandmother. Her grandmother, Molly Horniblow, known to the community as Aunt Marthy, was herself a remarkable figure. She had been promised her freedom years earlier and had been cheated of it by an enslaver's family. She had, through decades of Sunday market selling, baked goods, homemade goods, quiet and relentless labors accumulated enough money to purchase her own children out of slavery, one by one. She had not been able to purchase herself. She was technically still enslaved, but she was respected in Edenton, by black and white alike, in the way that people of exceptional moral force sometimes earn, a grudging respect even from those who hold power over them. Harriet told her what Norcom was doing. Her grandmother took her to Norcom's wife, Mrs. Mary Norcom. Mrs. Norcom did not help her. Mrs. Norcom consumed by jealousy. A jealousy directed not at her husband, but at the 13-year-old girl he was tormenting became another source of danger. This is the architecture of that world. The enslaved woman trapped between the predator and the predator's wife. Both dangerous, both unpredictable. One hungry, one jealous. And Harriet, 13 years old, navigating between them every single day. For 4 years, Harriet resisted Norcom. 4 years of whispers and threats, and the daily terror of a man who owned her. And then at 16 she made a choice. It was a choice born of desperation. It was a choice that would haunt her. It was a choice she owned fully, without apology. In the pages she would later write, she entered into a relationship with a white man named Samuel Treadwell Sawyer, a local attorney, a member of the North Carolina General Assembly. Sawyer was not a hero in this story. He was not a villain either, entirely. He was a white man of his class and time, who did some things Harriet asked of him and failed at others completely. But Harriet's reasoning was precise. If she could not escape the sexual violence of enslavement, she would, at the very least, choose who. She would exercise the only fragment of agency available to her. She would not wait for Norcom. She would later write, "It seems less degrading to give oneself than to submit to compulsion." She was 16 years old when she made that calculation. And she was right. She and Sawyer had 2 children, a son, Joseph, a daughter, Louisa. Norcom's fury at being denied, at being defied, at the existence of children he had not fathered became volcanic. He threatened her. He threatened her children. He threatened to sell them all south. And Harriet began, somewhere in the back of her mind, to plan. There is a phrase in the records of the antebellum, South, that appears again and again. Sold South. It was the ultimate weapon. The threat that ended arguments, broke wills, silenced resistance. To be sold south meant to be sent to the deep. South cotton and sugar plantations. Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, where the labor was harder, the death rate higher, and the distance from everyone you had ever loved was measured in hundreds of miles. To be sold south was to disappear. Norcom used this threat the way a man uses a knife, not always to cut, but to remind you the knife is there. Harriet had by this point 2 children. Joseph was born approximately 1829. Louisa was born approximately 1833. Both were enslaved from birth. Both belonged legally to the Norcom family, not to their mother, not to their father, to the man who had spent years tormenting their mother. Samuel Sawyer, the children's father, was aware of this. He had, to some degree, the means and social position to do something about it. And he did eventually do something. He purchased the children through an intermediary to avoid appearing to act against Norcom directly. He purchased his own children from their captor. This should have been a relief. And in some ways it was. But Sawyer never freed them. Not legally, not on paper. He took Louisa north with him as a servant. He sent Joseph to work. He moved on with his life. He married a white woman. He had other children. He did not free the children he had with Harriet Jacobs. Not yet. And by the time he might have, the machinery of his own comfortable life had overtaken whatever intentions he might have harbored. This is the part of the story that the comfortable versions leave out. The white men who helped were incomplete heroes. The white women who helped were exceptions. The system did not malfunction when it hurt Harriet Jacobs. The system worked exactly as designed. In 1835, Norcom's threats became specific. He told Harriet he was sending her to work in the fields, hard labor, the kind that broke bodies, and that her children would follow if she did not submit to him. She was 22 years old. She had been enduring this man's obsession for 9 years, and she made a decision. If she disappeared, she reasoned, if Norcom believed, she had fled north. He might sell her children rather than keep them, and if he sold them, Sawyer might purchase them. Sawyer had the money. Sawyer had the motive. Sawyer was their father. It was not a certain plan. It was a gamble. It required her to vanish, to trust a man who had already shown her the limits of his commitment, and to leave her children behind. She was a mother. She knew what she was choosing. In 1835, Harriet Jacobs ran. She ran 3 blocks. She hid in a swamp first. Days among the insects and the mud and the sounds of searching men and baying dogs. Norcom had immediately raised the alarm. He advertised her in the newspaper, the American Beacon, dated August 1835, describing her in the clinical language of property notices. Ran away from the subscriber. An intelligent, bright mulatto girl named Linda. She's a good seamstress. She has a decayed spot on a front tooth. He listed her features the way a man lists a lost horse. From the swamp, she moved to the house of a white woman, a woman Harriet does not name in her memoir, to protect her. This woman hid her in a bedroom, fed her, kept her secret for weeks, while Norcom's searches swept through the community. And then Harriet went home, not home to Norcom, home to her grandmother's house. Her grandmother's house sat in Edenton proper, the last place, logic said, that Harriet would hide, which made it, by a cold calculation, perhaps the safest place. The hiding place was above the roof, a small crawl space, a storeroom of sorts, built into the eaves above the porch of the house. Harriet described it herself. 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, 3 feet tall at the peak. Less than that on the sides, no windows. One small hole, barely larger than a human eye, that she and her Uncle Philip cut into the wood with a gimlet, a small hand drill. Through that hole she could see the street. She could watch her children walk past. She watched Joseph and Louisa pass beneath her hiding place, not knowing she was there. She watched them grow. She spent 7 years in that crawl space. 7 years. From 1835 to 1842. In summer, the heat in the eaves was extreme. Temperatures that she described as nearly unbearable, that caused her limbs to swell, her skin to crack. In winter, she could not move for the cold. She had no fire. She had no lamp most nights. She developed permanent physical damage. Her limbs would trouble her for the rest of her life. Her vision was affected. She would never fully recover the use of her legs as they had been before. And she read. She sewed. She wrote letters. She wrote letters to Norcom, dictated to someone who would post them from the north, designed to convince him she had escaped to New York. She was in the attic of her grandmother's house in Edenton, North Carolina. She was writing letters that placed her, convincingly, in a city she had never visited. Norcom traveled north to find her. To New York. To Boston. He did not find her. She watched him leave from her hole in the wood. She could hear through the floor the voices of her children. Her grandmother brought her food. Her Uncle Philip maintained the secret. A small network of people who loved her kept her alive. She used the gimlet to drill small holes along the boards, to let in air, to let in light, to have more than one eye on the world. She describes in her memoir a Christmas when she could hear her son Joseph directly below her. She could hear him breathing. She could hear him laugh. She did not call out to him. She held still. She made no sound. A mother 6 feet above her child, silent, watching through a crack in the wood. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. This is a documented, verified account of a woman's life in a country that called itself free. In those 7 years, Norcom continued to threaten. He sold her on paper to his son, a legal maneuver to confuse any northern free papers she might obtain. He sold her again and again. 9 times across the legal record, Harriet Jacobs was transferred, sold, or assigned. She was never present for any of it. She was in the attic. In June of 1842, Harriet Jacobs left the crawl space. She had spent 7 years preparing. She knew Norcom's patterns. She knew the routes. She had letters of contact in the north. She had people. Her daughter Louisa had already been taken north by Sawyer and was living, still enslaved in all but name, in Brooklyn, New York. Her son Joseph was in Edenton. She made her exit in darkness. She was carried to a boat, then to a ship, a vessel heading north along the Atlantic coast. She arrived in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, free soil, Quaker networks, the first organized anti-slavery infrastructure in the nation. She was taken in. She was given shelter. And for the first time in her life, she was in some technical sense free, but not safe. The Fugitive Slave Act was the machinery of her continued captivity, even on free soil, under federal law that northern states were compelled to enforce. A formerly enslaved person who had escaped could be seized anywhere in the country and returned to their enslaver. Harriet Jacobs was, under the laws of the United States, property. She was property in Pennsylvania. She was property in New York. She would be property in Massachusetts. Anywhere she went, under any law that governed the nation, she could be taken. She went to New York. She found Louisa. She held her daughter for the first time in years. She found work as a nursemaid for the family of Nathaniel Parker Willis, a prominent New York author and editor. She was respected. She was trusted. She was still enslaved on paper. In 1849, Norcom died. His death should have ended the pursuit. It did not. His daughter, Mary Matilda Norcom Messmore, the woman who had technically owned Harriet since she was 5 years old, was now an adult, and she wanted her property back. In 1850, after the strengthened Fugitive Slave Act passed, the Messmore family sent an agent to New York. Harriet went underground again. She had escaped a crawl space to enter a city that would not protect her. The Willis family helped. They sent her to Boston, and eventually to the household of Cornelia Grinnell Willis in Massachusetts. Cornelia Willis, with Harriet's grudging and complicated consent, purchased Harriet's freedom from the Messmores in 1852 for $300. $300! That is what the law said Harriet Ann Jacobs was worth. She was finally legally free. She was 39 years old. Most people at this point would have been done. Most people would have rested. Most people would have disappeared into whatever quiet life they had built and never looked back. Harriet Jacobs was not most people. She had a story, and she knew, with the precision of a woman who had spent 7 years listening through a hole in a board, that the world needed to hear it. In 1853, Harriet Jacobs began writing. She had no ghostwriter. She had no editor at first. She had the literacy that Margaret Horniblow had given her as a child, the literacy that had allowed her to write false letters from a crawl space in Edenton, and she used it. She wrote her life. She wrote it with full names changed to protect the living. And the dead, she called herself Linda Brent. She called Norcom Dr. Flint. She called Edenton Edenton, a slip, or perhaps deliberate. She wrote about the harassment. She wrote about the crawl space. She wrote about her children. She wrote about the choices she had been forced to make, and owned them, without apology on the page. This was radical. In 1853, a black woman writing about sexual violence inflicted on her by a white man was not writing something the publishing industry was prepared to receive, not because it wasn't true, not because it wasn't important, but because the conventions of the time required enslaved women's suffering to be presentable, clean, acceptable to white readers who needed to be convinced, not confronted. Harriet did not write a presentable story. She wrote the truth. She first approached Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the woman whose fictionalized account of slavery had become the best-selling novel in American history. Stowe's response was to offer to incorporate Harriet's story into her next book. As material, as content, Harriet declined. She was not material. She was not content. She had her own voice. She had earned her own voice. She was going to use it. She found, eventually, Lydia Maria Child, abolitionist, editor, writer. Child agreed to serve as Harriet's editor, helping to shape and prepare the manuscript for publication. Child was careful to note in her own preface to the book that she had not written it. Child wrote, "I am well aware that many will accuse me of indecorum for presenting these pages to the public. For the experiences of this intelligent and much injured woman belong to a class which some call delicate subjects. This peculiar phase of slavery has generally been kept veiled, but the public ought to be made acquainted with its monstrous features." The book was published in 1861 under the title Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself. Those last 3 words were necessary. They were an argument. They were proof. Written by herself. Because in 1861, a significant portion of the American public would have assumed she could not have. The book sold modestly. The Civil War was beginning. The country was convulsing. Harriet's quiet, precise, devastating account of one woman's life was published into a nation that was about to tear itself apart over exactly the question she raised. For almost 100 years after its publication, incidents in the life of a slave girl was doubted. Scholars, white scholars predominantly, questioned whether it was real, whether a formerly enslaved woman could have truly written it herself, whether the crawl space was real, whether Norcom was real, whether any of it had really happened. In 1987, historian Jean Fagan Yellin published the definitive scholarly edition of the book. She had spent years in the archives. She had found the newspaper advertisements. She had found the court records. She had found the letters, the census data, the property transfers. Every name was real. Every date was real. The crawl space was real. Harriet Jacobs had told the truth. She had always told the truth. The question was whether the truth-tellers were willing to listen. Freedom for Harriet Jacobs was not an ending. It was a beginning of a different kind of labor. When the Civil War began, Harriet went south. Not back to Edenton, not yet, but to Washington, D.C., and then to Alexandria, Virginia, where formerly enslaved people who had fled the Confederacy were living in camps that the Union Army called, grimly, contraband camps. They were not prisoners. They were not free. They were somewhere the law had not figured out. Yet to people who had escaped slavery, who were now technically under Union military jurisdiction, living in conditions that were, by documented account, desperate, Harriet went to help. She organized relief efforts. She helped establish schools, schoolrooms in whatever space could be found, church basements, old warehouses, tents. She helped set up a hospital space. She distributed clothing, food, medicine. She worked alongside her daughter, Louisa, the child she had watched walk past beneath her hiding place, now an adult, now free, now working beside her mother. They were documented. Their work was reported in Northern abolitionist newspapers. Their names appear in the records. Harriet Jacobs and Louisa Jacobs, mother and daughter, working, building. In 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, Harriet traveled to Savannah, Georgia. In 1865, after the war's end, she returned to Edenton, North Carolina. She returned to the town where Norcom had whispered at her when she was 13. She returned to the street her children had walked down while she watched. Through a crack in the wood, she returned to her grandmother's house. She opened a school there, and a free reading room in the town that had owned her, in the town that had advertised her return like a lost horse. She came back. She built something. She returned to the north eventually, to Boston, to Cambridge, to Washington, D.C., where she spent her final decades. Her son Joseph had died in the war. He had enlisted with the Union Army. He had fought. He had not survived. Louisa lived. She remained close to her mother for the rest of their lives. Harriet Jacobs died in Washington, D.C. on March 7, 1897. She was 83 years old. She had outlived Norcom by almost 50 years. She had outlived the institution that had defined the first 4 decades of her existence. She was buried in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her grave is marked. You can visit it. For a long time, fewer people knew her name than should have. The book was out of print for most of the 20th century. Her name was not in the standard histories. The crawl space, that 9 foot by 7 foot by 3 foot, chamber of endurance and survival, was not in the textbooks, because the history of what happened to women like Harriet Jacobs is inconvenient. It requires us to look at a version of America that does not resolve cleanly. It requires us to ask questions about who gets remembered, and why, and who decides. But she wrote it down, in her own hand, with her own voice, in the voice she had protected through 9 transfers and 7 years of silence. She wrote it all down. There is a thing that people say about survival. They say, how did she endure it? As if endurance is the miracle. Harriet Jacobs did not merely endure. She planned. Every year in the crawl space was a year of planning. Every letter she dictated and sent north was a plan. Every conversation she overheard through the floorboards was information she catalogued and used. Every contact she maintained, every trust she cultivated, every relationship she preserved, these were not accidents. These were the architecture of a future. She was building from inside a space, 3 feet tall. The gimlet hole she bored in the wood, that small, deliberate act. She did not wait for a window. She made one. This is what the history of enslaved resistance looks like, up close. Not always the Underground Railroad, not always the dramatic flight north. Sometimes it looks like a woman in a crawl space, unable to stand, unable to walk, in constant physical pain, drilling a small hole in a board so she can see her children grow, so she can stay oriented to the world she intends to return to. Historians have documented that the practice of patient, long-term planning for escape was a feature of many enslaved people's survival. Frederick Douglass planned for years. Harriet Tubman made 19 trips south after her own escape. William and Ellen Craft planned for years before disguising themselves and walking out. These were not impulsive acts. These were the result of patient, methodical minds operating under extraordinary pressure. The system told Harriet Jacobs she had no mind worth considering. She used that mind to dismantle, piece by piece, every constraint it placed on her. She was sold 9 times on paper. Each sale was, on some level, a statement that she was a thing that could be transferred, a thing that had no continuity of self across transactions. She wrote a book that proved she had continuity of self across every transaction they had ever made, every sale, every transfer, every year in the dark. She had been continuous. She had been Harriet. She had been the same woman in the crawl space that she was at. Margaret Horniblow's kitchen table, learning to read. They bought and sold the same woman 9 times and never managed to own her. She spent 7 years in a space 3 feet tall. She could not stand, but she could see. Through the hole she had made herself, she could see everything. They built the cage around her. She built the door.